Welcome to Philly Coco Presents Side Project Spotlight, episode 30. This is a developer's journey into making cool stuff. We are the backup dancers to your developer boy band. I'm Kotaro.
I'm Steve.
And I'm Aaron.
And we are Philly Coco, a Philadelphia-based Cocoa Heads community focused on Apple development. That primarily, but not exclusively, means iOS, Mac, tvOS, and watchOS development. Philly Coco's true desire is to take you higher on your own developer journey. All right. You'd think after 30 episodes that I'd feel comfortable with these intros, but each one is like a potential train wreck in my mind. But Aaron did bring up an interesting point before we just got on the air here. We actually are past our 1 year anniversary of doing this thing, right, Aaron?
Yeah. Well, what was the date, Steve?
October 9th, 2021.
So I think it's worth a round of applause. Congratulations, we somehow managed to pull this off, even though that wasn't not necessarily our intent in the beginning. In the beginning, we intended to do this as sort of our accountability podcast.
And that went out the window with this next project.
Well,
so.
Somewhat. It's not. It's somewhat. Yes,
Yes.
We can mention it, but
Sure.
Yeah, but it's evolving. I think now we're adding in some other ideas here that we wanted to talk about. Like last time, we were talking about what is an app, and this week we're going to talk about another subject that comes up a lot at Side Project Saturday. But we might as well address the elephant in the room since Aaron brought it up. Yeah, we don't have an update for that app because we've all been super busy with our schedules and holidays are coming up and all that stuff.
I will say it reminds me of a lot of like and maybe this is a topic for a different another podcast later down the road, but assuming where we're going, if the scenario is like we drop it for whatever reason, this type of project, like how that kind of evolves over time, and a lot of it is just momentum, and a lot of it can be life happens, a lot of it can be we just lose interest with a lot of side projects. So not to say that this would happen this way with this project, I still feel like I could have some usage of if I put some time into it. But again, like you said, the holidays are coming up.
Maybe we need to schedule a working session.
Maybe a side project Saturday.
Unfortunately, that it always just turns into chat Saturday.
That's true. Although I think even if they were, like, there's usually like one or two moments where we break through in, like, we sit down and we like collaborate on the core problem we're trying to solve at that situation. So I think one of them, when we did it last time, we were trying to like hash out some core data issue, if I remember correctly. I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong there.
It was that, and then there was some UI issues, and then that led to actually getting a whole bunch of UI components built.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right. I mean, the tough part is like, at least I can talk to some degree in terms of a lot of it is like SwiftUI work in terms of like what we do, but a lot of it's really in my mind, I think there are a lot of like when you do that for 8 hours on the day, I mean, even though like that's all sprinkled, when you work, everything is like relative to like how many meetings you have and like how many coffee breaks you take. But the challenge is like mentally when you come back home, you're like, do I have to really look at Xcode again for another 2 to 3 hours? Like that's.
I've been, experimenting with different times to do it. Like sometimes in the morning for like 20 minutes or something, and sometimes in the evening or around lunch if I'm not, meeting up with anybody for lunch. And then so it's hard. You gotta find that kind of scheduled time, I think. And weekends are especially hard though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's the time you have to recharge, especially like all of us, again, are full-time. If it was me on a contracting, I can like break that out much better because when you're contracting, like weekends don't exist, to be honest.
But it's tough now. I mean, it's just a busy time for all of us at work, and it does kind of drain you. And you got to prioritize the work that brings you in money.
Yeah,
right now. So But whatever, we'll get back to that. Just bear with us, and in the meantime, hopefully you're finding these other more focused thematic podcast episodes valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of interesting. Like when we first started, a lot of it was us just rambling on a variety of different topics, but usually around the framework of our of our topic at hand. I think like what we were working on, how we were building, and we were just deep diving into like what we were working on. So I think that was kind of interesting compared to now.
Well, then let's deep dive onto the topic at hand.
As usual, our Arcwood transition is today. What is our topic?
Well, I mean, last time we talked about how my question about what was an app. I don't know if you listened to it, Aaron.
I did.
You did. So he's all caught up. So we were talking about this because I'm working on new projects, and you, Coulter, and you and Aaron, you both have been doing a lot of prototyping and with new frameworks. And so the obvious next kind of topic here is what is prototyping and prototyping versus wireframes and all these questions around prototyping, because I'm doing that right now in my job too, but like for myself versus or because I'm a lone developer more or less versus what you guys are doing and however you're doing it part of your team. So I thought there was a lot of topics in there we could talk about. But how do you want to start out the whole conversation around the concept, the theme?
I guess we want to I guess set the boundaries on what is prototyping, at least in the context of what we talk about. I think it's much closer to like if I would make an analogy, I tend to make an analogy to like movie making processes. So like when you look at concept arts in like Star Wars and how that would be, you can consider those like the wireframes of the movie industry versus like maybe like storyboarding scenes and shots and kind of creating sort of like kind of like a basic movie, if you will.
Yeah.
With like stand-ins and cutouts, just for framing purposes, that would probably be closer to prototyping into app developer world. So, whereas in the context of app development, wireframes are kind of like these static designs and layouts of the app's UI, and maybe you can kind of step through each one. But they don't particularly interact with the user in any real way. Whereas prototyping is a little more, you press the button takes you to another screen, you press another button, takes you to another screen. And so that is much close, and you can see the UI transitions, or at least some facsimile of a UI transition from one screen to another screen. That I feel is, in our context, what prototyping is. And one of the things that's interesting about it is like there's degrees of prototyping you can discuss, right? So like if you do prototyping in Sketch, because I'm not familiar with how Figma does it, but if you do it in Sketch, you can press a button and you can create these wireframes, right? So let's say you have screen 1 and screen 2, and you have a button in screen 1. You can have it so that the button, you press that button, you have a play kind of like a play screen, so like you can actually go through the screens, and you press the button on screen
like
1.
like you would on a slide deck.
Yeah, exactly. You press the button in screen 1, and it'll push to screen 2. You can create the navigation to push to screen 2. It's very rudimentary. You can even do it on device. But there is the magic trick in it. It can only last for maybe like a minute until you try to press other buttons. If you didn't wire the whole screen, nothing's going to work. Like not everything's going to work, and it actually tells you where the hit targets are. Thus sort of creating detaching you back out of that reality, right? So it's more immersive, but not as immersive as like a real app.
Yeah. So you mentioned a few different tools, but before we go into like maybe more details about tooling for prototyping, like why are you doing this? Like why do any of this stuff as a developer? This is like a lot of new people, I think, get often or people, newer developers get kind of confused about the concepts. Like when do I wireframe prototyping?
I think one of the things that so I used to do a lot of indie freelance work, and I would, in terms of like creating some wireframes for my clients. And I would try to follow the process that normally you would do. So you would create a very basic layout, right? Black and white. You don't want them to get caught up in the color schemes and the branding, and you just want to make sure that they understand this is how this thing is laid out, right? So you create a ton of these screenshots, basically, of different views, and then you can even create links then to just show how they would interact with each other. And then you would go, okay, are you happy with the layout of this wireframe, right, for each of these screens? Like, and do they make sense? You know, it's still kind of like concept-y, but you're just trying to get them to understand like how the data is laid out, like in the relationships between them. Does that interaction make sense to the client? And if it makes sense to them, then you move on to more high fidelity wireframes. So now you add in the color, you put in the icons, you add some images, you do all sorts of you rounded corners, do all the branding, etc., etc. And but the thing is, like, when you're doing all this, you're doing it from a full, huge screen, a huge monitor. So context is tough for you to get a sense of, like, how does this look on an actual device? How does this feel? How does your thumb react, your thumb placement feel according to, like, where you place the button? Because if you place something, as an example, if I'm left-handed and you place the add button in the top right corner, like, it's hard for me to reach that. So maybe you might want to be selective of when you put that in the top right corner, right? As an example of, like, experientially why it makes sense to test it on device, but it's hard to do when you're prototyping on a wireframe.
Yeah, so this is like a type of prototyping, you're saying, but you're doing it with more with wireframing tools. See, I was thinking more like, like prototyping is a very common, I think, technique now, but there's other like philosophies of producing software that don't necessarily do a lot of prototyping. Like there's a traditional kind of like waterfall method, or you write like elaborate specs, which would also include wireframes. So like I remember doing like specs for stuff. Like I had classes on this, how to do a design document and everything. Sure. And that was, I wouldn't call that prototyping, because you were building wireframes often as part of the documentation, the spec, but it wasn't I consider prototyping, for me, it needs to have that interactive element to it.
Sure. And
otherwise it's like it's maybe upfront design, or it's more of a traditional like UI mock-ups, but it's not a prototype. So and it's static.
So I'm it's almost prefixing with like what it was before, and then maybe you might sometimes you would get to the absurdity level of like trying to create those interactions. Like in order to showcase an interaction, you might create it in After Effects or something. And then, so the way I looked at it was like Figma or XD and Sketch had like very rudimentary tools for you to create those, create better interactions. When SwiftUI came out, for me at least, and I think this has always been the case, is you could use the basic toolings of UIKit or React or some other framework that's a little easier to do, to just rapid fire create these screens and then maybe build a simple app to demonstrate what you're trying to showcase to the user. But when SwiftUI came out, all the views can be fairly lightweight and fairly easy to create in a short period of time. That's what I thought was very powerful about SwiftUI, is like to use it as a prototyping tool is amazing in a lot of ways. You can do the drop shadows, you can do the blend. Like what changed my mind about using it as a prototyping tool was the fact that it had blend modes in it. It had the drop shadows, it had the rounded corners, it had all that in modifiers, or other or in some sort of way. It's just easier to do in like one line of code to create this experience, to create simple experiences that would take, several lines of code, if not a whole framework or a library to integrate so that you can get the effect that you want.
So yeah, so the way so kind of today,
Mhm.
there's the traditional, I don't know, we call it mock-up workflow for prototyping, which is what you described using some tool like Figma or
Mhm.
Sketch. You're drawing the screens, starting with low fidelity screens means like black and white. They don't look like the actual UI. They're just about layout and
Mhm.
how the data is organized. And you get sign off on those screens, and then you can link them together in a rudimentary way with some basic transitions. There was a good talk that Apple even did. I think we probably mentioned this before on WWDC some years ago about using Keynote to do this very thing, to build little prototypes.
Yeah.
Then you could, so like the more advanced version of this was putting it on a phone. With some prototyping tool, you usually have some app like like Keynote has an app on there, and you could tap the screen. And I've done that. I still think it's very useful because it's really fast,
Sure.
especially in the UI kit era. That was a lot faster to get the very basic thing, because most apps you're going to have a button that's going to change the screen. That's going to be the primary interface, so you can do a lot with one of these tools. But with SwiftUI, it's evolving. So now, how much of that do you do versus just jumping into SwiftUI and then we can and just starting the prototype, and then we can talk about how you actually do it, because I think people are probably pretty familiar with how to do it with Figma and Sketch and stuff. It's somewhat straightforward. You draw them, and then you literally draw them and then link them together in the tool so they go screen to screen.
Yeah.
But in SwiftUI, I find myself gravitating more towards just going right into SwiftUI for prototyping, especially if it's a focused idea.
Sure.
Like I talked about last time, this this carousel screen I built for something, and it was just a lot faster to just go into SwiftUI, and it took only a few lines of code to get that working versus me and my limited artistic skills going into like Sketch or something and trying to draw it, and then try to, as you explained earlier, try to somehow visualize this thing in with a bunch of static images when I could just make it in SwiftUI. So that's with me. I'm tending to gravitate more towards just going right into SwiftUI.
I mean, the thing that I find interesting is there is something to be said about there's like a je ne sais quoi about
French.
Yeah, I know, right? Ooh la la.
It's too fancy for this podcast.
To get it in your hands, to know that it's an actual app, right? So we have the app icon, you have the app icon, you open it, you tap on it, goes into the app, you're toggling through your tab bars, the feel of it just feels much more. There's a nuance there that a product owner or a stakeholder or a client will go, oh, wait a minute, like this is my app. This feels close to real, even though like in my rational brain is like, I know this is just a prototype. I know these layouts are just, I mean, they're done correctly in a sense, like as if you were to build it like a real app, but I know the content's fake, but I still can't get past this feeling like this works like a regular app. Like we could ship this. Sometimes I get a little, you think they're gonna get a little too enthusiastic. Like no. Don't look behind the curtain. The code's horrible.
So for a more modern prototype approach, what I'm asking is like, where do you start? Are you still like sometimes you still going into Sketch, or are you doing it less and less now? As I said, I'm doing both. I mean, I don't think either of us would say we do none of it, none of like stuff in Sketch, whatever. But have you seen that change since you were doing SwiftUI versus UIKit days? Because it has for me. As I said, I think in the UI, if I would strictly UIKit, I would focus much more on the traditional mock-up workflow, and now I'm more about getting quicker into the SwiftUI world just to get things rolling.
I don't know, Aaron, if you have an opinion, but
I guess I don't know how much we can say about the work we're doing, but I mean,
well, just in general.
Yeah, no, just I mean, like it's like for our work, we get like some pretty high fidelity designs before we start building anything usually. So it's kind of not quite the same thing of just, oh, it's us and we feel comfortable jumping into the code. We still have like usually a pretty good direction of where we're going before we write any code.
So you could jump into the code more because you already have that up front. Someone else already did the mock-ups and
right.
thought about the design of the things. Yeah, that's interesting. So
it doesn't always make sense. Sometimes we have to say, oh, that's not going to work in code. But
So that was I was thinking. Sometimes when you have like a design team doing stuff, doesn't that mean, as you said, sometimes you're going to get designs you can't implement, or that you have to push back and get a compromise because of the platform limitations, or is that just not the case because everybody you work with is so in tune with the platform that they don't usually make designs that don't work?
Not necessarily.
I can only speak of like projects in general. In terms of like, sometimes we'll get like when I worked for clients, sometimes I'll get wireframes that I know will not work, and I'll explain it to them in a sense of like, here are the reasons why this is a bad idea, right? For whatever reason, whether it be like you want us to link to this view here in this sort of style transition, it's a bad design decision because X, Y, and Z. And if they push for it because, for whatever reason, then I will do what the client tells me to do. This is my general philosophy. I will tell them up front it's a bad idea, or I don't agree with it for whatever reason. I will do it for them because sometimes people need to see it. People need to see it, feel it, to understand that it's a bad idea. So in the future, when they come to me again with some design and I make an opinion about it, they know I'm not coming in a place of like ignorance or, lack of knowledge that I don't understand design or something. It's because principally there are certain reasons why it's a bad idea. So as long as you explain yourself in a way that in the context that, that tension is fine. Like in my mind, it's like, if that's what you want, I'll do it. I just think the reason why I think these are bad ideas or this is not going to work is this laundry list here.
Yeah. So when you're an independent consultant,
mm-hmm.
your process tends to be you're receiving some kind of wireframes and starting with them, and then building prototypes based on it. It's just all over the map, because I feel like there's some different nuances to how to do prototyping depending on your situation. Like if you're a consultant with a client, or if you, like you guys in your day job, you're a big company, there's different expectations of where you're starting from and what resources you have to begin, versus like my life where I'm like the one-man band kind of developer at work for this. So for me, when I think about prototyping, I mean, I'm thinking like I have to quickly move forward. And what is the most efficient use of my time starting from zero? Like I need to figure out how to design this, how to build it and everything. And I'm thinking in terms of, for me, when I'm prototyping, especially with SwiftUI, I'm thinking, what do I get out of the box? And so, and how is that going to be good enough? And what can I? And so that's why I want to start with the SwiftUI lately, just so that I get the idea of what out of the box is going to look like. Aaron?
We're also doing this kind of the same thing of, we're presented with these pretty high quality designs, but it's also what we're making is a prototype still. So we're not trying to make anything that's okay. We're never actually going to ship this directly. So it's like we have to decide what makes sense for the timeline that we're working on, which is usually pretty quick. It's like they give us these designs and we need to turn them around into code. So we need to figure out what's the quickest way to get something that's functional. So, and a lot of that's relying on like built-in SwiftUI stuff, because it's just really fast. And it's when we run up against those SwiftUI limitations where it gets fun. So we have to come up with some creative solutions to work around some of those limitations.
The reason this often comes up, and like I think we've done talks, I think people have done talks about this in Philly Coco, or at least I've seen talks elsewhere about mock-ups and wireframes and prototyping and what's the difference and how do you like. I remember doing a talk about. I don't think it was at Philly Coke. It was like a one-off thing I did on Drexel's campus like some years ago. It was like, and I was talking to some students about the process of app development, and because I think this comes up a lot. Like, how do you build an app? Like, and even in real corporate life, you have managers always chasing down different kinds of processes. Like that's the manager world. Like what agile process do we use or something? But I think a lot of students when they're starting out, they're not necessarily taught. At least they weren't when I was younger. Like, how do you build these things like from start to finish? And I think a big part of that process we've learned works is that iterative prototyping process. So then it's like specifically what kind of advice do you give to a new developer to say like how do I get started? Like literally what tools, what process do I do to get started sometimes?
Want to go first, Saren?
You go first.
Like if you're think new person on Side Project Saturdays. Like I'm new developer. How do I want to build an app? Like what do I do to get started this?
Just do the basics. I think sometimes people want to make a JRPG before they can make a basic, ping pong game as an example.
Yes. Well, okay. The idea. Let's assume we've talked to them and we've gotten their idea down to something more reasonable, and now they want to start building the app, and they're like maybe one guy or a few guys. Like what process do they go through?
I mean, we always get a lot of people who want to do their own social media platform.
I know. I don't know. Well, I guess maybe nowadays maybe that'll change. I don't know.
Maybe, but it'll just be all crypto stuff now. But the difference is that their journey at the moment is that of a beginner versus that of somebody who understands the whole stack of what they're trying to embark on. Much less like the app itself is actually the weaker component there. Having said all that, I think when they build an app they start in something like SwiftUI, which is actually probably, if I was to say, like the best way to start nowadays is to do the app in SwiftUI and learn that framework. It doesn't take that much to learn and do well. I mean, there are pain points for sure, but it's not as bad as like trying to like pick up UIKit at this point. And then just build your prototype and just
I remember advice years ago. I think it was more like, get Sketch, design your screens, or it's like prototype in quotes, like your screens, mock them up, and then try to implement them in UIKit. And now I'm saying, I guess what I'm asking is like, is that first step always necessary, or how often is that necessary anymore? Because to me, I think it is still definitely necessary sometimes, but I think you can actually start straight in SwiftUI sometimes if you don't need to do really custom UI things. Like if you even just to like start, I think a part of the process of prototyping is to even flesh out an idea. If that's what you're using prototyping for, just go in there and do it, because then it doesn't really matter what the UI is, because you're more about trying to figure out what the app is going to do. Of course, all these things have caveats, because it
also depends on what you're more comfortable with.
Yeah.
Like if you are more comfortable with the graphic design software,
excellent,
then definitely jump in and take that as far as you can. But if you're like more of a new programmer,
so if you're like more of a design focused guy, or and you're more familiar with Photoshop, maybe you use a tool like Figma to do your mock-ups and your prototyping, and then you might find it easier to start there and then transition into SwiftUI, because I think SwiftUI
it's definitely easier. No matter like how, even with how easy SwiftUI is, it's definitely easier to have some kind of target of where you're going, whether that's like a design document or a whatever sketch layout or something.
I will say one of the drugs about prototyping, for me, if I could use that term, is just the absurdity you can get away with. So I think one of the things that I've always done with prototyping is push it to the edge of what is real versus what is a prototype. That's my aspiration in terms of like adding haptics, adding sound, adding animations that are just a little bit absurd, adding a little bit of juice, as they say in the gaming industry, just to give it that extra like, whoa, like this is cool. Maybe like a squish on a button when you tap on it. The cards flipping, maybe UI transitions that are a little more expressive than what you would expect. Spring animations, just all sorts, and then integrating like even stuff like core Bluetooth or some of the specific Apple frameworks, whether it be live, Dynamic Island or Siri Intents or something like that. Like just get stuff in there that are surprise and delight, but not necessarily or even like something as stupid as dark mode, which nobody's going to care about but you. But it's easy to implement. It's not. It costs you like a day tops.
Well, if you SwiftUI, it's like built into most of the views that it generates.
Exactly.
By default.
Yeah. So I think that then one of the things that you're creating an argument for the design team without having to express it like in their face, or you're making compelling arguments for the design team, I should say, or for the production team. Sometimes like, you think you're getting in the way of one of the teams, or all you're doing is you're creating a vision of what it could be.
Yeah, I mean, you can have a wonderful, beautiful, high fidelity mock-up, but it just might not be possible to build, or it might not be possible to build in the time frame you have, or whatever, or there'll be some other kind of limitation you'll find when you actually build it, and so you'll have to give that feedback and then make modifications.
Just imagine as a designer, you're tasked to create all these high fidelity wireframes, and then you're tasked to create the dark mode version of it, right?
Yeah,
like that's absurd. You should never be asked to do that. Maybe one screen, that's it.
Yeah, one screen to get the color palette, maybe.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
and then the rest can be done as like the general like, okay, well, we understand the system for this. Just now apply it to all the screens, and if they have problems with a specific one, you can deal with it then.
I like that SwiftUI lets me build something that feels like a real app. I think though there's a danger in that too, because we've talked about this. I know we talked about it at my job in the past before, and in school, I think, about whether you how high fidelity do you want a mock-up to be, and again, because you can give whoever the the product owner, whatever verbiage you want to use, but that's what the group that's asking for this work, you can give them like the wrong impression about what the end result will be sometimes, if you're not careful. Or other times you do kind of need to do a high fidelity thing because you're updating maybe the current app, and you have to give them something that lets them see it in more of a realistic context in order to make some kind of decision that you're asking them to make about it.
I approach it in very much the similar way as like game jams. Having done so many game jams, feels like it almost preps me for this job. But the idea is you have such a constrained amount of time, but you're trying to create a prototype, basically, where you're making a very simple game with a very simple game loop, and you're trying to cram in as much of the feel of the game as possible, so that when you get people to test your game, to play test your game, they get the intention of what you're trying to get them to do, right? And so like, I think app prototyping is very similar in a sense of like, you're trying to create something, a vertical slice or whatever you want to call it, very straightforward thing to get them to understand the intention of what you want them to do, right? And sometimes that doesn't work out in user testing, or sometimes when people play test, you're like, why doesn't he not press that button? Why doesn't that person not go to the thing that I want them to go to? But that's good, because that's the whole point of prototyping, is to almost in a real contextual manner, flesh out whether or not your your designs are actually working. They actually make sense.
So we talked a lot about kind of all over the place about prototyping and the process. Do you guys have any like favorite techniques or aspects of SwiftUI that have helped?
Introspect. Basically, what it does is it allows you via modifiers to take a view, depending on which one it supports, and actually access its UI kit component, for which then you can do something with that versus like having to do all sorts of weird hacks.
Well, just because usually if you don't want to build a UI view representable thing from scratch or a UI view controller representable, you can do some things with a like global UI kit components where you can override them globally and like on a peer in your view or something like that. But this package allows it to do it per view, like only affect that particular view's underlying UI kit class. Yeah, I don't know. I guess the main thing is like I don't know how long it's gonna last, like, or if Apple's gonna push some update that's gonna break how this works. But as long as like there's these underlying UI components to SwiftUI, which I'm sure that's gonna be around for a while. That this thing, it's like if you actually look at the source code for it, it's like fairly simple. Of like it just like looks through the UI kit hierarchy and finds the particular view that you want, the particular UI view or UI view controller. Yeah, it's interesting if you know a little bit of UI kit to actually take a look at how that code works.
Right. And it keeps things pretty clean and still centered around the SwiftUI view, so you don't have to like do, again, like you said, like create a UI representable.
Right. If you don't want to go through all the UI kit or boilerplate stuff of setting up your UI kit classes.
I mean, honestly, it's probably something Apple should include on some of them.
Yeah, some of these features, like, why can't I just access that in like the view initializer or something, or with a modifier?
So it's great when you want to do parlor tricks that are a little more complex in nature, like with the scroll view or something like that. The other thing that I forgot. The question is favorite prototyping techniques. So, I will like to look at the prototype when it's done, or like when it's when it's laid out, and I would like to go, how do I make this better? That's my general like thought process. Like, what is the magic that I need to add to make this feel good, or make this because it's not like I have the constraints anymore of being a responsible production app developer. Like, that is not our job at this point. Like, our job is the razzle dazzle in a lot of ways. The other thing that I remember working on this contract a while back, maybe about 2 to 3 years ago, where it was a production app. It was going to be in production, so to speak. And the absurdity in which this app, this client wanted me to make so many of these interesting, complex UI interactions. And this was in UI Kit too. If it was SwiftUI had come out, all these things would have been 10 times easier. But the point is, like, we were doing some crazy stuff with like AV movie player, hot swapping movies in between just to create the 3D effects that we were going for, and like WebKit integration with like weird UI transitions and fade effects and like UI view animation everywhere. It was just wild. It was absurd. I mean, like, none of these things were like, or like using the accelerometer to affect the gradients that were happening in the background.
Oh my God. This is a lot. This is all one project?
Yeah, one project. Oh, one screen. How's that?
One screen?
We were talking.
A super screen?
No, it practically felt like it, but it was like imagine a video player with particle effects, and we were throwing some tensor action in there.
Wow.
And you were doing like we were doing masking to get some effects. So like some parts of the movie was actually clipped out so that stuff can like bleed through. It was wild. some stuff using like some scrubbing that was done and we had like some kind of we used some particle to like identify where your thumb was to like get the kind of like weird like particle effect to follow your thumb.
What was the view controller code for all this?
Oh, it was a hot mess, but
it sounds
that's how I do.
Yeah, man, but yeah, that sounds like something you could have made more easily implemented with SwiftUI, and you would have probably ended up with a cleaner implementation just because of the nature of SwiftUI views, where you kind of forced to separate views after a short period of time.
I don't know. I'm sure it was. I mean, you could still make a hot mess, especially when you're.
Oh yeah, you can make a mess in anything. But I find myself in SwiftUI, especially making the views smaller as I go.
Yeah,
like I'll start with one screen, and I'll add stuff in there. I'll add like the struct that I might need in there, or the class I might need as data, and I'll add the view, and maybe I'll add like a view builder or something. But then you're like, okay, well now I can just separate some of these in other files, and it's real easy to do. Versus UIKit with all the delegates and stuff, and then you're like, once you hook that up to the view controller, now you want to move it. Now you got like now there's more work involved, and things are going to break.
Let me tell you, when you sneak in SpriteKit into a view. And do some crazy or scene kit in a view. Like this is the thing, right? I don't know if you've seen the game Persona 5. So if you ever get a chance, just take a look at Persona 5. Just do YouTube Persona 5 UI, user interface or whatever, and just watch how they do those transitions. They are the most absurd transitions I've ever seen in a video game for a menu screen. I want to do that. I want to do that level of absurdity. I want to be there. Give me that space. And again, because I feel like
that would be a little overkill for some apps.
Here's the thing. I think about that a lot, right? I think about like even if it ends up being in production. I think about it in the sense of like people have grown up at this point with video game UIs, doing all sorts of absurd transitions. And yes, accessibility is an issue that you would definitely have to address. But the point being is like the expressiveness of them, the sort of like the chaotic nature of these UIs it's beautiful. It's just
isn't this the logic that leads you into metaverse?
It could. I don't dispute that possibility
because that's not to get on too much of a tangent, although that's kind of our thing here. Is that whole idea is that it's a much more rich environment to operate in. You have much more higher fidelity experience. That's right. So you can have and so technically it's crazier interfaces if you think about it, because it's like mimicking you actually like touching and drawing on an actual whiteboard. Like you could do that, and you're mimicking that through the interface and the controller and stuff, and that's way more complicated than just having you literally do it on a touch screen or something. But you get a different kind of immersive experience. So taking one step back from that, we're talking about video game UIs in an app. We have SwiftUI Introspect. We have basically to iterate your prototype, make it like a video game, and
is that the advice?
That's your advice. Make it like Persona 5 transition. No. But I actually,
well, I did go off on a tangent. I guess if we're talking about advice, start basic. Get the meat of it right, because in the end, that's what your clients, your product owners demand. And then once you get there, once you're done, figure out ways to make it feel better. Because in the end of the day, when you're prototyping, you're trying to replicate a feel of the app. Not so much like, I know like everybody talks about like like I wanted to get interactive, but you're trying to interact. You're trying to get the right feel of like what you want the users to do, and make them feel like they're using a real app.
Yeah, that's a good point. I actually here's a little tip. Screenshots. Use the screenshot feature in Simulator or on your phone, because what you're gonna if you build something. No, I'll tell you why. Because sometimes you need to show these things off in a meeting or something, and or it needs to be seen by somebody later if you're not in that meeting. So I found it just easy sometimes where they need a screen for something. If I make it work on like the actual I make the prototype just look like it's a real app, and then I just take a screenshot. that I give the screenshots can be the mock-ups that they're going to show in some meeting. They don't have to know that it's actually technically working code, So
we usually do like a screen recording for that. So we'll record a little bit of the.
So I found that the screen recording with QuickTime, I did that the other day. That was great because I was like, okay, I need to show this little thing working, with the gestures, and that's all I did. I made a recording and it was good.
I do.
So, you can record right. You can record right on the iPhone now. You don't even need to use QuickTime.
Oh yeah, it's true. I was I had it in a simulator and I was too lazy to try to put it onto my phone.
Oh, that's a head slapping moment. I keep forgetting that's a thing you can do now.
Yeah, you know what I did? This is so hacky because it would have been better to do it on the phone. I actually use QuickTime. You can select what part of the screen to record, so I drew the rectangle around the SwiftUI preview, not even the simulator, the preview, and got it. And I just got it to work.
Yeah. I've done that.
See,
depends what stage of development you're at.
And it's funny because for prior clients, sometimes they take those prototypes into BC meetings. I was like, "Wait, no, don't do that."
I did a prototype. I did a prototype once with the iBeacon. Yeah, I did an iBeacon demo once, and I did it really quick before. I think some break and I left. I just left the iPhone there, and I think they actually took it. They actually took it to a meeting, and I had it set up so you had two iPhones, and you got it close to one, and it would do something, and just to demonstrate, one became the iBeacon, one was the sort. And apparently they took that to a meeting, and it was very impressive, and we still didn't build it.
That's another advice. It's please don't be precious with your code. It's not going to go in production. It's okay. Let it go.
Don't be precious. Don't.
I just written this thing and now it's going to go to waste. I think there's an emotional toll that might be. And it's this is great education. You're learning a lot. You're going to use this code somewhere else for your own purposes. Don't worry. For another project or another prototype, don't worry. Let it go.
Yeah, that's an excellent point to kind of wrap things up on. When you're prototyping, assume you're going to throw it out, even if you don't.
Yep.
Because that prototyping is more of a process than it is an end in itself. Yep. You're exploring ideas or you're implementing someone else's ideas in order to see how feasible they are and to gain feedback. It is an iterative circle like anything else in development. So you pick the tools that are going to work for you, given your situation, and don't worry too much about it. And if it turns out that they love what you did with your prototype and SwiftUI, whatever, then maybe you'll be able to reuse some of that code, and that's great. But if not, it's still worth it.
I guarantee you won't be able to use it. You'll be able to. You know what it is? It's it's the happy path, which means the people who ultimately end up implementing it will look at it, understand it to us, relatively well, assuming you do a good job documenting, and then do a way better version, way more optimized version. That's the hope. Cross my fingers. That's the hope.
Right. Well, in your case, you pass it off to other people, right? Sure. In my case, I'm going to have to look at my prototype code and then make it production.
In that case, I think when you're doing those types of prototypes, you're doing that with the understanding that you're going to develop it. So you're actually treated in a much more the architecture with a lot more respect, especially if you know that that's going to be the thing. Game developers that I've known in the past would take a prototype and completely trash it and start anew on a new project and take little bits and pieces and completely refactor it. So again, when you're prototyping, you don't need to be precious with the code. That's all we have for today then. You can learn more about PhillyCocoa at phillycocoa.org. There you'll find links to our Slack, meetup schedule, and contact info. If you're feeling generous, please leave a review on Apple Podcast app and share us with all your developer friends. And one more thing. Just food for thought. Software undergoes beta testing shortly before it's released. Beta is Latin for still doesn't work. Till next time, good luck on your developer journey. We're cheer for you always.
Unfortunately, that it always just turns into Chat Saturday.